The boat cut through the leaden water, a rusty blade against a canvas of gray. I watched the mainland recede, its distant hills blurring into the low-hanging fog, and felt a quiet exhale leave my lungs. This was it. The last thread to the world I'd so deliberately untangled myself from. Marcus, the cartographer, escaping the cacophony, seeking the silent geometry of the forgotten world. This island, this lighthouse, it was my new grid, my new North Star. The journey had been long, the small vessel pitching and rolling with a restless energy that mirrored the unease in my gut, an unease I attributed to unfamiliarity, not premonition. The air grew colder with every nautical mile, carrying the sharp tang of salt and something else, something ancient, like whetstone and forgotten iron. The boatman, a man whose face seemed carved from the very rock of the island, didn't speak much. His silence was a comfort, a confirmation of the solitude I craved. He just steered, his gaze fixed on the indistinct horizon where the island was supposed to materialize. And then it did. Not with a dramatic reveal, but a gradual, spectral emergence from the mist. First, the jagged teeth of the coastline, then the dark, brooding mass of the island itself, crowned by the stark, solitary sentinel of the lighthouse. It was taller than I'd imagined, its whitewashed exterior stained with streaks of green and black, a testament to decades, centuries perhaps, of relentless sea spray and neglect. A skeletal structure against the bruised sky. My sanctuary. We docked at a rickety wooden pier, the timbers groaning under the boat's weight. The island was a desolation of gray rock and sparse, wind-stunted vegetation. No welcoming committee, no bustling port. Just the boatman, the creaking wood, and the mournful cry of gulls. Papers, the boatman grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp, pointing towards a low, squat building set back from the pier. Intake holding area. Power's out. Been out since dawn. I nodded, clutching my worn leather satchel, its contents, maps, compass, drafting tools, feeling suddenly inadequate against the sheer, overwhelming presence of this place. The air within was damp and smelled of dust, stale paper, and something metallic, like old pennies. A clerk sat hunched over a desk, illuminated by the lantern, its weak glow doing little to dispel the gloom. He was a thin man, his spectacles perched on the end of a nose that seemed too sharp for his face. He gestured vaguely at a stack of forms. "Marcus, is it? Inherited the old place, did you?" His voice was flat, devoid of curiosity or warmth. I confirmed my identity, signing my name by the lantern's trembling light. The power outage meant everything was manual, slow, steeped in an almost ceremonial quiet. The clerk didn't look up, just stamped the forms with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the small room. He pushed a set of tarnished brass keys across the desk, their weight clinking against the wood. Lighthouse keys. And the smaller one, that's for the supply shed near the base. You'll need it. Not much else on this rock, you see. He finally met my gaze, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes, not pity, not judgment, but a deep-seated weariness, as if he'd seen this transaction, this hopeful arrival, play out countless times before. The boatman was already casting off, his back to me, the engine sputtering to life, the last link to the mainland about to sever. I watched the boat pull away, a receding smudge on the gray expanse, until it was swallowed by the omnipresent fog. I was alone. Truly alone. The path to the lighthouse was overgrown, a faint scar on the rugged terrain. The wind, as the clerk had warned, was beginning to rise, plucking at my coat, whistling through the dry grasses. The air thrummed with the low, persistent growl of the ocean, a sound that would be my constant companion. With every step, the lighthouse grew larger, more imposing, its decaying grandeur asserting itself. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, rooted in the very bedrock of the island, a silent witness to countless storms and untold isolation. Up close, the neglect was stark. Paint peeled in curling flakes, revealing patches of weathered stone. rust wept from the iron railings that spiraled up the exterior. The heavy oak door at its base was studded with black iron, groaning on protesting hinges as I pushed it open. A gust of wind followed me in, stirring the dust motes that danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows. The interior was a cavernous cylinder of cold stone, the air thick with the smell of damp, salt, and something else, a faint, musky scent, like old paper and dried flowers, yet subtly unsettling. My footsteps echoed unnervingly on the stone floor as I stepped into the central shaft. My canvas. And for the first time, a prickle of something less definable than unease, something akin to an ancestral memory of forgotten things, stirred deep within me. The lighthouse wasn't just old. It felt aware. And I, Marcus, the reclusive cartographer, was now its newest inhabitant. I stood alone on the small, slick dock, the heavy brass keys still cold in my palm, the only sound now the rhythmic sigh of waves against ancient stone. The air was thick with salt and the metallic tang of damp earth, a raw, untamed scent that filled my lungs and, for a moment, settled a strange calm over me. This was it. No turning back. Just me, the island, and the lighthouse looming against the bruised twilight sky. The path to the lighthouse was less a path and more a suggestion of worn rock and stubborn grass, winding upwards through a tangle of sea-beaten shrubs. I had to make several trips, hauling my cartography equipment, my drawing tables, my rolls of parchment, and my few personal belongings. Each ascent was a test of endurance, the wind a constant, unseen hand pushing against me, the growing darkness making the uneven ground treacherous. The lighthouse itself, when I finally reached its base, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a sentinel, its circular walls of rough-hewn stone towering above me, a silent, imposing presence. The front door, a massive slab of oak studded with rusted iron, groaned open with a sound like a dying beast. Something old and stagnant, like forgotten history. The ground floor was mostly empty, a cavernous space where echoes lingered, catching every breath, every shuffle of my boots. I spent the next few hours working methodically, driven by a determination to make this place my own. I set up the portable generator I'd brought, a small, humming contraption that eventually coaxed a few dim bulbs to life in the main living area, a circular room a few floors up from the base. My work, my maps, my instruments, these were my anchors, my connection to a world of logic and precision. I cleared a space near a tall, arched window, the glass thick and rippled, distorting the view of the churning sea. Unfurling my largest, blonkiest parchment across a collapsible table, I laid out my compasses, my dividers, my fine-tipped pens. The crisp white of the paper was a stark contrast to the faded, peeling paint of the walls, a promise of order in this wild, untamed place. As I meticulously arranged my tools, a soft, almost imperceptible flicker danced in the single bare bulb hanging overhead. I glanced up, my brow furrowed. Just old wiring, I muttered to myself, tapping the table. The light held steady. The wind outside had picked up, howling around the stone tower, making the entire structure feel like a giant, resonating shell. I tried to discern distinct sounds, to rationalize them, to identify the sources. The rattle of a loose pane, the groan of timbers settling, the sigh of the sea. But then, amidst the clamor, I heard it again. It wasn't the wind, this sound felt different, closer, more intimate. I stopped, my hand hovering over a protractor. I turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. Too much hauling. I returned to my work, losing myself in the familiar ritual of preparing my space. I had brought a small, heavy brass sextant, an antique I treasured, and placed it carefully on a narrow shelf by the window, intending to clean it later. A little while later, as I bent over my map, sketching out the preliminary lines of a new coastline, my eyes drifted back to the shelf. The sextant, which I distinctly remembered placing with its polished lens facing the window, had subtly shifted. Its heavy brass body now angled inwards, its eyepiece pointing directly at my drawing table. My breath hitched. I knew I hadn't touched it since setting it down. I walked over, my movements slow, deliberate. I told myself I must have been distracted, that perhaps I hadn't paid enough attention, or the subtle vibrations of the old building had caused it to turn. Yes, that was it. The building was old. It settled. Things moved. Perfectly logical. The flickering of the light became more frequent, almost a pulse, mirroring the quickening beat beneath my ribs. I found myself pausing more often, listening, straining to hear, to understand. Each time, there was nothing. Just the vast, empty sounds of the lighthouse and the sea. I decided to unpack a few more boxes, to fill the space with my presence, with the tangible evidence of my life. My heart leaped. The generator, I thought, scrambling for my flashlight. It must have run out of fuel. They seemed to rise, to coil around me in the profound black, no longer distant, no longer faint. They were closer now, a soft, breathy murmur, just beyond the reach of my understanding. I froze, my hand still gripping the flashlight, my knuckles white. It was just the wind, I insisted to myself, just the old building settling into the night. It had to be. I returned to my work, losing myself in the familiar ritual of preparing my space. A little while later, as I bent over my map, sketching out the precise, jagged coastline of the island, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the stone floor beneath my feet. But then it happened again, a low, resonant groan that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the tower, a sound like ancient bones grinding together. It wasn't the rhythmic creak of timbers settling, which I'd grown used to, but something deeper, more organic. I paused, my charcoal pencil hovering above the parchment, listening. The air in the lantern room, usually still, felt suddenly heavy, cool against my skin. The light from the single bulb hanging overhead seemed to flicker, just for a breath, before regaining its steady glow. Old buildings, old systems. It made sense. Still, the unease clung to me, a damp shroud. I couldn't quite shake the image of that deep, internal shudder. My cartography work, usually a bomb, felt less engaging now. My gaze kept drifting to the dusty corners of the room, to the shadows cast by the heavy lens assembly. I decided to take a break, to stretch my legs and perhaps explore the lower levels of the lighthouse, areas I'd only briefly surveyed. Maybe fresh air would clear my head. Descending the winding, cast-iron staircase, the sounds of the lighthouse amplified. The constant sigh of the wind outside seemed to press against the stone, and the distant crash of waves felt closer, hungrier. I reached the ground floor, a cavernous space mostly used for storage, and ventured into a smaller, forgotten room tucked away behind a stack of rusted oil drums. It was a damp, lightless space, smelling of brine and decay, colder than the rest of the tower. My flashlight beam cut through the thick gloom, illuminating peeling paint on the stone walls, spiderwebs hanging like tattered lace, and scattered debris. In a recessed alcove, half hidden beneath a collapsed shelf and a pile of sodden canvas, I spotted something. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover warped and discolored, almost black with age and moisture. Curiosity overriding my lingering apprehension, I knelt and carefully pulled it free. The leather flaked beneath my fingers, and a fine dust, smelling of mildew and something faintly metallic, plumed into the air. This wasn't just old, it felt ancient. I carried the book back to the relative light of the main ground floor, wiping away the grime with my sleeve. It was a journal, its pages thick and yellowed, many of them stuck together. The script inside was a tight, hurried scrawl, faded but legible. The first entries were mundane, detailing supply shipments, weather observations, and routine maintenance. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. It belonged to a previous keeper, a man named Thomas, judging by the occasional signature. Then, the tone shifted. The entries grew shorter, more erratic. Dates were sometimes skipped, then crammed together. The light. It watches. I feel its gaze, even when my back is turned. It's not the lamp, not the glass. It's deeper. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the strange pull I'd felt myself, that sense of being observed. But the words on the page felt too raw, too honest. But the wind doesn't know my name. The wind doesn't speak of forgotten things. My eyes darted around the silent, empty room. The silence wasn't comforting, it felt expectant. I flipped more pages, my fingers trembling slightly. The ink was often smeared, as if the writer had been crying, or perhaps the damp had seeped in even as he wrote. It isn't just the weather. It comes from within the walls. It wants to settle in my bones. It was a primal, unsettling word in this context. A scraping, like something trying to get out of the floorboards. It wasn't a common term for a lighthouse storeroom. It suggested a more structured, perhaps even desperate, use of the space during a specific, harrowing event. I shivered. My earlier tremor, the groan from the tower's depths, suddenly felt less like old building quirks and more like echoes. The entries grew increasingly desperate. Thomas's handwriting deteriorated into frantic scribbles, the words tumbling over each other. It wants my memories. It wants my sanity. Don't let it take yours. Whatever you do, do not look into the heart of the light for too long. It will pull you in. It waits. It's always been waiting. I slammed the journal shut. The sound echoed loudly in the stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat. This wasn't some fanciful ghost story. This was a man's descent, meticulously documented, and it mirrored the subtle shifts I was already experiencing. A low, guttural moan rumbled from somewhere above me, deeper and more prolonged than anything I'd heard before. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the structure. It was a sound that vibrated in my teeth, in my very bones, and it seemed to thrum with a terrible, ancient hunger. The lighthouse wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a trap, and I was already inside. The journal lay accusingly on the small table, its leather cover still vibrating with the force of my slam. I could feel the frantic pulse in my throat, a physical manifestation of the unease that had taken root. This wasn't some distant, abstract terror. It was a cold, creeping realization that the man's unraveling in those pages was a roadmap I was already following. I dismissed them, rationalized them. But now, the dismissal felt like a deliberate act of self-deception. Outside, the air had grown heavy, pressing against the glass. I walked to the window, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. A wall of gray was rushing in from the horizon, not just clouds, but an entire ocean of them, boiling and bruised. The storm hit with a sudden, brutal force. The wind shrieked, a banshee wail that tore at the very fabric of the structure. I tried the radio, twisting the dial frantically. Static, only static, a furious hiss that mocked my attempts to connect. The mainland, once a distant comfort, was now an unreachable fantasy. I was truly, utterly alone. The thought settled in my gut like a stone. The storm raged for hours, relentless. The lighthouse beam, usually a comforting sweep across the inky black, seemed to struggle, its light diffused and swallowed by the tempest. Every gust of wind was a personal assault, every crash of waves against the rock below. A threat. The journal drew me back, its pages a morbid magnet. I opened it again, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned to the next entry. Day 78. The storm has been relentless for 3 days now. No contact. The supply vessel won't attempt the crossing in this. I am cut off. The isolation is a physical weight. I hear things now, distinct from the wind. And the light. It feels different. Not just a beacon, but something. Day 78. 3 days. I looked out the window again. The storm showed no sign of abating. It felt like an eternity already. I'd heard them too, hadn't I? But the words on the page felt like my own unwritten thoughts, plucked from my subconscious and laid bare. A sudden, violent surge of wind slammed into the tower, rattling every pane of glass. The entire structure groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through my bones. I fumbled for my emergency lantern, its beam cutting a shaky circle through the gloom. The lighthouse beam, the very heart of the structure, was gone. This was where supplies were offloaded and temporarily stored before being brought up. It was a damp, concrete space, usually bustling with the sounds of crates and the generator's hum. Now, it would be a tomb. The faint, metallic tang I'd noticed before was stronger down here, almost cloying. My lantern beam danced across stacks of empty crates, old ropes coiled against the wall, and the hulking, silent form of the generator. I could almost feel it pressing in, a tangible presence. Nothing. Just the crates, the ropes, the wall. Was that the faint scrape of metal on concrete? I froze, straining my ears over the thrumming of my own pulse. I managed to get the generator to sputter, then catch, coughing to life with a loud, mechanical groan. Back in my living quarters, the journal still lay open. I picked it up, my eyes drawn to the next entry, a desperate scrawl. Day 80. I am losing time. The light. It pulses with a rhythm that isn't mine. It speaks to me, not in words, but in feelings, in forgotten memories that aren't even my own. Am I mad? Or is this place? Is it showing me what it truly is? My own head throbbed. Forgotten memories. Faces in the glass. I remembered the fleeting reflections, the way the light seemed to shift and coalesce. Was it the storm, the isolation, the relentless pressure of the journal, or was the lighthouse truly beginning to show me its nature? The line between my own anxieties and the previous keeper's descent blurred, becoming indistinguishable. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the grit of stubble, the dampness of my skin. My own reality felt flimsy, like a page about to tear. I was trapped, not just by the storm, but by the relentless, encroaching doubt that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. My head still ached, a dull throb behind my eyes, a ghost of the storm's fury in the journal's unsettling words. Faces in the glass. The thought clung to me like a damp shroud. I'd spent the morning trying to dismiss it, to attribute the fleeting reflections to exhaustion, the oppressive solitude, or the way the light played tricks in the ancient tower. But the rationalizations felt thin, brittle. There was a cold certainty settling in my bones that the lighthouse, this colossal sentinel, was not merely a structure but something else entirely, something that had begun to show me its true, hungry nature. I tried to focus on my maps, the intricate lines and contours of the island, but the ink seemed to writhe on the parchment. My hand, usually so steady, trembled. I pushed away the drafting table, the quiet scratch of my pen suddenly unbearable. Then, it started. A low, guttural moan seemed to emanate from the very stone beneath my feet, vibrating up through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sea. It was a sound of profound, ancient despair, a lament that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. I told myself it was the settling of the foundation, the old timbers shifting. But the sound lingered, a drawn-out sigh that ended in a sharp, percussive thud from somewhere below. I'd bolted it an hour ago, a futile attempt to impose order on a place that defied it. My fingers brushed the rough wood. No response, just the low hum of the lighthouse's machinery, usually a comforting thrum, now a buzzing menace. I pushed the door open, peering into the gloom of the stairwell. Nothing. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. This was no trick of the light. This was deliberate. I descended, each step a conscious effort. The silence stretched, taut and menacing, until it was punctuated by a distant, rhythmic clank. 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 It was the main light. The huge, complex mechanism at the very top of the tower, usually a smooth, silent rotation, was now stuttering, laboring. I could feel the vibrations, an erratic shuddering that spoke of something terribly wrong. It was like a mad, disembodied eye, frantically searching, seeking. A prickle of ice ran down my arms. This wasn't just a malfunction. This was a tantrum. A deliberate act of disruption. It was trying to unmoor me, to break my focus, to sow chaos. I pressed on, drawn by the unsettling rhythm and the increasingly potent smell. The stairs opened into a lower level, a network of storage rooms and maintenance tunnels I hadn't fully explored. The air here was thick, stagnant. The clank of the light above was now accompanied by a faint, wet drip, drip, drip from somewhere ahead. This part of the lighthouse felt ancient, untouched for decades. It felt wrong. As I moved deeper, the walls seemed to press in, the very air growing heavy, stifling. I felt a sudden, profound wave of loneliness wash over me, a feeling so intense it was almost physical, as if every solitary moment of my life, every missed connection, every quiet evening spent alone, had coalesced into a suffocating shroud. It was a targeted strike, a weaponized emptiness. Then I saw it. A faint, flickering light at the end of the corridor, not from my flashlight, but a pale, sickly yellow glow. The corridor opened into a larger, cavernous space. This was it. The name, scratched on a rusted metal sign barely visible in the dim, pulsing light, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't a storage room. It was a place designed to hold things, to contain. The space was bare, concrete walls slick with condensation, a few rusted shackles bolted to the floor. The drip, drip, drip was louder here, echoing in the cavernous room. And then, I saw him. Standing in the center of the room, facing away from me, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, dressed in what looked like the tattered remains of a lighthouse keeper's uniform. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He was absolutely still, a statue of despair. My breath hitched. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. The figure didn't move. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his head began to turn. I wanted to run, to scream, but my feet were rooted to the damp concrete. When the light returned, the figure was closer. Too close. And he was no longer facing away. His face, if it could be called that, was a blur, a swirling vortex of indistinct features, as if his identity had been scoured away by time and torment. But his eyes were clear. And they were fixed on me. They were Marcus's eyes. My eyes. This wasn't just a hallucination. This was me. Or a terrifying reflection of what I was becoming. You found me. You found us all. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. And in his palm, resting on a tarnished silver locket, was a small, intricately folded piece of parchment. It was a map. Not of the island, not of the sea, but of the lighthouse itself. Below the X, scrawled in a frantic hand that looked eerily familiar, were two words, the feed. He waits. We wait. The entity wasn't just in the lighthouse, it was the lighthouse. And it was hungry. I wasn't just an inhabitant. I was the next meal. And the previous keeper, the one who looked like me, was trying to warn me, or perhaps, to drag me into his eternal torment. Light laughs. I hear it, a cold, mocking sound that slices through the roar of the wind. It knows I am trapped. I found myself pacing the narrow confines of the living quarters, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, each attempt plagued by vivid, terrifying nightmares. I'd wake in a cold sweat, convinced I'd heard a heavy footfall on the spiral stairs, or felt a cold breath on my face. Am I going mad? I'd whisper into the darkness, the words swallowed by the storm's howl. Is this what happened to Thorn? Am I just inheriting his madness? The line between reality and hallucination blurred. I heard his voice, thin and reedy, echoing my own fearful thoughts. Marcus, it would say, soft as a sigh. You're next. It's hungry. The malevolent entity, or perhaps the lighthouse itself, began to manifest with terrifying clarity. It was direct. Personal. Suddenly, the heavy oak door leading to the lantern room, which I had secured with a sturdy bolt, slammed open with a deafening crack asterisk, sending a gust of icy air through the room. The lantern flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish. I jumped to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. Just the open door, revealing the inky blackness of the spiral stairs. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Is anyone there? Only the wind answered, sighing through the open doorway. I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so violently I could barely slide the bolt home. Later, I was in the lantern room, performing my duties, though the beam was useless and I stumbled backward, the map's chilling revelation a fresh wound in my already fractured mind. And it was hungry. I wasn't just an inhabitant. I was the next meal. And the previous keeper, the one who looked like me, was trying to wah. The unfinished word, the blurred face on the aged parchment, twisted my gut. My flashlight, clutched in a trembling hand, skittered across the wall, its beam weak and erratic. The very air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in, heavy with the scent of salt, damp stone, and something else. Something ancient and hungry. My mind, already a tattered sail in a gale, threatened to rip apart. I needed to move, to understand, to escape. But escape felt like a childish fantasy. The lighthouse itself was the cage. Driven by a desperate, animalistic need for answers, I stumbled down the winding iron stairs, each clang echoing the frantic beat of my pulse. My feet found the cold, uneven flagstones of the ground floor, but the oppressive silence of the upper levels had been replaced by a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the structure. It was the lighthouse, I knew, settling, stirring. My failing light pierced through the gloom, revealing a heavy, barnacle iron door I'd barely noticed before, tucked away beneath the main spiral staircase. It was a utilitarian entrance, probably for supplies, now long disused. A faint, almost imperceptible draft snaked from beneath it, carrying a metallic tang mixed with the familiar scent of mildew and brine. I stepped into the intake holding area during power outage. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of stagnant water and old, forgotten things. My breath plumed in front of me. This space, I realized, was where the lighthouse truly began its descent into the earth, a forgotten maw. My light beam swept across damp stone walls, slick with condensation, revealing shelves laden with rusted tools, coils of stiff rope, and empty, broken crates. This was where the keepers of old would have received their provisions, their last tangible link to the outside world before the isolation truly set in. And then, I saw it. Tucked into a recessed alcove, half obscured by a fallen stack of rotten netting, was a small, crudely fashioned wooden chest. It looked out of place, too personal amidst the industrial decay. Inside, wrapped in oilskin that had long since lost its protective qualities, were several water-damaged, leather-bound journals. Their covers were cracked, pages swollen and warped. The faint, ghostly scent of old ink and despair wafted from them. These weren't official logs, these were personal accounts. The journals of the previous keepers. I pulled one out, its weight feeling immense in my hand. The script inside was faded, but legible. The first entries were mundane, observations about the weather, supply deliveries, the lonely routine. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting became more erratic, the observations more paranoid. The light. It watches. Not the beacon, but the very stones. My thoughts. Not my own. A whisper at the edge of hearing. The solitude is a hunger. It gnaws. I hunched over the journal, devouring the words, each sentence a spike driven deeper into my own sanity. It feeds on the forgotten. On the memories we cling to. The warning. I must warn the next one. It is not a place. It is a being. It is the light itself, hungry for minds, for souls. The words blurred before my eyes. My own memories, my reason for coming here, the quiet, the solitude, the escape from a world that had become too loud, suddenly felt like bait. The lighthouse hadn't offered solace, it had offered a trap. It had lured me with the promise of peace, only to prepare me for consumption. I flipped to the last journal, the one belonging to the keeper whose face mirrored mine on the map. The entries here were almost entirely indecipherable. Just fragments, repeated words, and then, a single, horrifying sketch. It was a crude drawing of the lighthouse, but instead of windows, there were eyes, and the beacon at the top wasn't a light, but a gaping, toothless maw. The lighthouse wasn't merely haunted by a malevolent spirit. It was the malevolent spirit. A sentient, predatory entity, a living, breathing, stone and glass titan that fed on the minds, the memories, the very identities of its keepers. It had lured them, isolated them, and slowly, meticulously, drained them of their essence, growing stronger with each victim. The previous keeper had tried to warn me, to finish his desperate message, but the entity had consumed him before he could. And I, Marcus, the reclusive cartographer seeking solace, was not just an inhabitant. I was the next intended meal. It was already beginning to digest me. The cold, undeniable certainty had settled into my bones, and now, instead of paralyzing me, it sharpened my focus. The lighthouse wasn't merely haunted, it was the malevolent spirit. A living, breathing, stone and glass titan. And I was trapped inside its belly, its next meal. Running was no longer an option. I had to fight. My mind, for all the entity's attempts to unravel it, was a cartographer's mind. It understood patterns, boundaries, the subtle language of space and influence. How did one map a spirit? How did one chart the contours of a hungry, ancient consciousness? I gripped my last remaining lantern, its feeble glow a defiant speck against the encroaching dread. I needed to disrupt its hold, to find a weakness in its spectral architecture. The entity thrived on light, on the beacon that drew ships and, more importantly, keepers. But what if the light went out? What if its power source, the very engine that made the lighthouse a lighthouse, failed? A desperate idea sparked. Not just the lamp, but the whole system. The journey down was a gauntlet. Every gust of wind rattling the glass above sounded like a hungry growl. I saw the previous keeper, gaunt and broken, his eyes mirroring the desolation I fought to keep from my own. I pushed through it, focusing on the generator room, deep in the lighthouse's foundations. When I finally reached the lowest level, beyond the main storage, a heavy iron door, previously unseen or perhaps psychically obscured, stood before me. I forced it open. The air inside was still, heavy, and tasted like forgotten time. This wasn't just a generator room. The room was vast and low-ceilinged, unlike anything I'd charted before. Massive, rusted hooks hung from thick beams, their chains dissolving into mounds of reddish dust. On the concrete floor. In the center, a hulking, silent generator sat, its massive flywheel caked in grime, its dials frozen. The power was already out. My own memories flickered like dying embers, snatched at by unseen tendrils.
The entity was trying to consume me, to absorb my identity, my very essence.
No, I rasped, the word a fragile shield against the onslaught. I fumbled in my satchel, pulling out my mapping tools, a roll of thick parchment, a compass, a lead pencil, and an ink pen. I spread the parchment on a relatively dry section of the floor, anchoring it with small stones. I couldn't map physical space here, the room itself was a distortion.
Instead, I began to chart the influence.
I listened intently, not to the words, but to the patterns of the sounds, the rhythmic drip of water, the distant groan of the structure, the rhythmic thrum that seemed to come from deep within the stone itself, like a monstrous heartbeat. I marked the boundaries where its influence seemed to ebb, even fractionally, and the terrifying nodes where it pulsed with overwhelming power. The entity raged against this defiance. The air grew frigid, biting at my exposed skin. They were the previous keepers, their memories twisted into tools of torment.
A wave of nausea washed over me, my hands trembling as I held the pencil. It wants me to stop. It wants me to lose myself. But the map was taking shape. I wasn't just charting, I was imposing order. And then I saw it. Not a weakness in the physical sense, but a flaw in its conceptual architecture. The entity, in its hunger, had no true boundaries for itself. It expanded, consumed, absorbed. But my map, by defining its territory, by drawing lines around its influence, was creating a boundary it couldn't breach. It was a parasitic existence, and like any parasite, it needed a host, a defined space to occupy. My map was not just a representation, it was a conceptual cage. And then, with a surge of desperate will, I drew a circle around that point, a perfect, unbroken boundary. The lighthouse shrieked. It wasn't a sound, but a tearing sensation in my mind, a wrenching, grinding agony that echoed through the very stone of the building. I heard the crash of metal, the splintering of wood from somewhere above. The entity was recoiling, thrashing, its psychic tendrils flailing wildly. I lay there, gasping, my head pounding, my body shaking uncontrollably. I had not destroyed it, but I had wounded it. I had charted its territory, and in doing so, I had drawn a line it could not cross. I had found a way to fight back, for now. The flaw wasn't a physical crack in the stone, no crumbling brick or rusted beam I could exploit with a crowbar. It was a conceptual rupture, a fault line in the very idea of the thing that had haunted this tower for centuries. It fed on isolation, yes, and on forgotten memories. It thrived in the silence that followed a life extinguished, absorbing the echoes of what once was until nothing remained but its own hungry presence. But what if I refused to be forgotten? What if I refused to let them be forgotten? My cartographer's instinct, that insatiable need to chart, to name, to impose order on the unknown, suddenly felt like a weapon. The entity wanted formlessness, a void where it could grow. My maps, my meticulous records, were the antithesis of that. They were anchors, assertions of existence. The lighthouse groaned around me, a symphony of ancient timbers and metal protesting the relentless sea wind. The entity knew. Not now. Not the physical lighthouse, but the entity itself. I had to name its hunger, define its method, record the identities of those it had consumed. And I knew just the place to do it. I descended, past the main living quarters, past the supply storage, deeper into the lighthouse's forgotten guts. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with brine. It felt like walking through a wall of static, my own thoughts struggling to break through. Finally, I reached the lowest level, a sub-basement I'd only briefly explored before. It wasn't designed as such, not originally. It was just a cavernous, unfinished space, meant for storing coal or heavy equipment, but it felt like the heart of the lighthouse's consumption. Here, the raw materials of forgotten lives, the remnants of human experience, seemed to be held before their final assimilation. The light flickered, threatening to extinguish completely. I cursed under my breath, fumbling for the spare oil I knew I had down here somewhere. The entity seized on my momentary distraction, a wave of disorienting fear washing over me. It was trying to erase me, to make me forget who I was, to make me one of them. No, I choked out, my voice raw. Not me. Not them. I found the small tin of oil, my hands shaking as I refilled the lantern. I pulled out my last remaining roll of parchment, the one I'd reserved for this. I had no ink, no pen, only a stub of charcoal from the old fireplace. Crude, but effective. Not a map of the room, not of the lighthouse. I began to map the presence around me. I charted the emotional topography of the space, marking areas of intense despair, sudden rage, overwhelming loneliness. These were the traces of the keepers, their final moments. The entity shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated in my teeth and rattled my bones. It manifested more strongly, not as a physical shape, but as a distortion of the air itself, a shimmering haze of malevolence that pressed in on me, trying to snatch the charcoal from my hand, to tear the parchment. The temperature plummeted. My breath plumed white. You feed on the forgotten, but I remember. I was drawing their stories, giving them form, refusing to let them be assimilated into its blank nothingness. This was the flaw. It could not erase what was defined. My cartographer's will, honed by a lifetime of bringing order to chaos, was a shield. It was wounded, not physically, but conceptually. It wasn't a victory, not truly. The entity wasn't destroyed. It was still here, its hunger still palpable, waiting. But I had asserted my presence, and in doing so, I had asserted theirs. The fog still clung to the island, but the lighthouse beam, now powered by its own ancient, malevolent will, cut through it, sweeping the dark waters. I could feel its gaze on my back, a silent promise that it would wait. I left the island on the dinghy, the small boat pitching violently in the churning waves. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I was no longer just Marcus, the reclusive cartographer.